We all know that Hanukkah has become a little bit of a commercial holiday. There's a lot of emphasis on gifts, on Hanukkah geld, and so on, which is, of course, a hallowed tradition, giving Hanukkah geld. The Rebbe actually increased the tradition from once a week, once during the week of Hanukkah, to giving Hanukkah geld every night of Hanukkah. But somehow, it seems like we've lost the appreciation or the recognition of the spirit of Hanukkah. Let's talk a little bit about the significance, the meaning, and the relevant lesson that is so necessary and indispensable today, so many years after the miracle actually happened. We know that Hanukkah is different from Purim, because on Purim, all Haman wanted was to kill Jews, to wipe out the Jewish people. He was bent on genocide. He didn't have any philosophical problems. He didn't have any religious problems. He was a classical anti-Semite who simply wanted to kill. Now, when we were saved from that attempt, from his plan, we celebrate. We celebrate Purim. How do we celebrate? By eating and drinking and sending food gifts and charity to the poor. The emphasis here, obviously, is on physical celebration through food and drink, sending food gifts, and through supporting the poor with money. And that's because we're celebrating the survival of the body, of the physical survival of the Jewish people. That's what the miracle of Purim was all about. The miracle of Hanukkah was very different, because the Greeks were not out to kill Jews, or the Assyrians. There was a war, of course. There was a battle going on, but the goal, the aim of the Assyrians was not to kill Jews. The miracle of Hanukkah is therefore not a miracle of physical survival. It's not the survival of the Jewish body. The miracle of Hanukkah is the survival of the Jewish spirit. And so we celebrate Hanukkah primarily by lighting candles, a more spiritual kind of thing. Now, in what way, what was it about the Assyrians or the Greeks that threatened the Jewish spirit? Was there forced conversion, like the Inquisition? No, it was not an Inquisition. It was not a crusade. The Gemara says that the Greeks prohibited the belief or the practice of Judaism in its classical form. They didn't mind Judaism in some other guise. There was a Judaism that they were comfortable with. But Judaism as it was practiced, they didn't like. In other words, they really didn't mind if you wanted to light Hanukkah candles or Shabbos candles, because lighting candles, and particularly at a dinner table, what could be nicer than that? They didn't mind if you observed Shabbos, meaning take a day off from work and go on a picnic with your family, or take in a movie. I guess in those days it was the Colosseums. That they didn't mind, because that's nice, that's good. What they objected to was, don't preach that God told you to keep Shabbos. Actually, the belief in God itself, they didn't mind at all. Because that's also nice. Belief in a higher being, it's noble, it's inspiring, it's uplifting. But God told you to keep Shabbos? Don't say that. Don't talk like that. This they didn't like. In other words, the Greeks at that time believed themselves to be, and possibly they were, ideal human beings. Perfect human beings. After all, they're the ones who created Western democracy. Their ideals were very high. Their standards were very high. Their aesthetic sense was very developed. The arts and the beauty in the world and in life and so on and so on. They appreciated all the finer things, including religion. The only thing they couldn't tolerate was Judaism. Why? Because Judaism didn't say light candles, it's romantic. Judaism doesn't say read the Psalms, it's poetic. And Judaism doesn't say don't work one day a week, it's good for your body and good for your soul. The Jews were saying, God told me, and this they couldn't tolerate. That's what they wanted to put a stop to. They wanted Jews to forget that Torah is God's Torah. Torah is beautiful and wise, that they agreed, that they didn't mind. Torah is God's Torah, this they could not tolerate. Because this undermined, in some way, it diminished the human being. So the victory of Hanukkah was basically the victory of godliness over humanism. And I'll explain what that means. It wasn't so much right over wrong. It's not that they were wrong, because in the literal sense, they were not bad people. They were not corrupt people. As far as human beings go, in the common sense of the term, they were good people. So it was not right over wrong. It was a battle, a struggle between godly versus goodly. They believed that they were good. And they were. And Judaism comes along and says, yes, that's fine, but it's still human. And beyond goodness, there is godliness. And they couldn't hear that. They had no tolerance for that. And maybe that's why, of all the holidays and of all the mitzvahs in Torah, there's only one mitzvah, only one holiday, where an essential ingredient in the observance of the holiday is to let non-Jews know that you're celebrating it. For example, it's not a mitzvah at all. It doesn't enhance the mitzvah to have your Seder, your Pesach Seder, in public so that everyone can see. That's not part of the mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah to celebrate Sukkot in such a way that the non-Jew will see it. Of course, it's difficult to hide a sukkah. So technically, of course, people are going to see it. But that's not the virtue. That's not the obligation. It doesn't enhance the mitzvah to have everyone know that you're doing it. And there's certainly no mitzvah to make sure that non-Jews notice how you observe Shavuos or Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or even Purim. The only exception is Hanukkah. In Hanukkah, it's an essential, integral part of the mitzvah of lighting the candles is that they should be seen in the streets. So why is that? There was nothing that Jews or Judaism needed to teach Haman and the Persians back in those days. What are you going to teach them? Not to kill? Not to hate? There was no argument that had to be settled between us. They wanted to kill us, and we preferred not to die. There was nothing to argue about. There was no issue to debate. And there was no message that they hadn't heard or they needed to hear that would change their mind and settle an issue. So when we celebrate the miracle and the victory of Purim, we don't have to tell non-Jews about it, because what are we telling them? That we don't like to die? That we enjoy living? What was there to say? When it comes to Hanukkah, the victory, the miracle of Hanukkah, was the statement that humanism is not the highest or the most desirable, truest way of life. Beyond humans, there is godly. beyond humanism, there is godliness. And so no matter how perfect a human being you are, to serve God is much higher. Now this is something that everyone has to know. This is a legitimate issue. And the correct answer, the correct attitude, has to be made known. The answer has to be, godliness is infinitely higher than the most perfect human behavior. When the Jews came back to rededicate the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, after the victory against the Greeks, they went looking for a little pitcher of oil that hadn't been contaminated, that hadn't been touched by the Greeks, as the Talmud says. They found this little pitcher. There was oil enough for only one day, but a miracle happened, and it burned for 8 days. Question. Why did they have to go looking for oil that wasn't or hadn't been defiled? There's nothing wrong with using oil that is defiled. It's still kosher. Defiled here meaning touched by death. I'll explain in a minute. Secondly, how could they be sure that they would find? What made them confident? They came into the temple, they took a look, and saw that the Greeks had been everywhere. Everything had been touched. Everything had been looted. How were they so sure that if they searched, they would find a pitcher of oil that had not been touched? And then also, why was there a little pitcher of oil? It doesn't seem very economical. Why make little pitchers of oil that had enough oil for only 1 day, for lighting the menorah for 1 day? Who would store oil like that? And if it was a started jar or pitcher and had only 1 day's burning left, then how did they know that it wasn't contaminated, that it hadn't been touched? So it must have been a sealed jar, and in the sealed jar there was only 1 day oil for 1 day. How do we understand all this? The Rebbe taught that this contamination that they were trying to get away from was not certainly a physical contamination. It wasn't even a halachic contamination. Now, halachically, according to Jewish law, ritual law, contamination means that anything that comes in contact with death, with a corpse, becomes ritually unfit. You can't use that product in the temple because the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, was a source of life, and any touch of death, any hint of death, any contact with death would make it unfit, inappropriate for the temple. However, in a time of war, when people were fighting and there was bloodshed, and they were all directly or indirectly in touch with death, then if they touched the oil, they would contaminate it, but you would still be allowed to use it. Because since everyone is contaminated, you can't get around the problem. And so in the condition where the people are touched by contact with death, then the food they eat, the products that they use, will of course also be touched by that hint of death. And it's kosher because there's no way around it. So this should not have stopped them from lighting the menorah. So there's no sense in trying to find oil that was not contaminated when everybody else was contaminated anyway. So if they were worried about a halachic contamination, if they were worried about the tumah, that is a halachic problem, the halacha itself permits them to use the defiled oil under the circumstances in a time of war. So they wouldn't bother. They wouldn't need to find oil that had not been contaminated. They wouldn't have to go looking for a pitcher that was still sealed. So they obviously were worried about something else. They were not concerned with whether the oil was halachically fit. They were concerned whether there was the godliness to the oil that they were looking for. They were looking for oil that didn't have a touch of the Greek, of Hellenism. What is the touch of the Greek? Basically, what they were trying to get away from was the philosophy of humanism that the Greeks represented. Human logic. Human logic dictated that you have a temple. You've regained it. You're in control. You can light the menorah, and it's a beautiful thing to do. It symbolizes the light of the world and all sorts of wonderful things. So take the oil and light it. What are you so picky about? The oil will burn just as well as any other oil. And it's not even against the rules. Halachically, you're allowed to use it. So go ahead. Light the menorah. And they said, no. That's the touch of the Greek, and we're not going to do that. We need oil that has the seal of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest. Not just the Kohen, not a regular priest, but the high priest. What is the significance of the high priest? It is the level of devotion of service that the high priest represents. The Kohen Gadol was not allowed to leave the temple ever, for anything, not even for a funeral in his family, because his only existence, his only life, his only environment was that of godliness, to the exclusion of everything else. And that is super rational. So the idea is that they went looking for a little pitcher of oil that had a seal of the high priest. They wanted to light the menorah with a devotion to godliness that transcends human logic. Logically, it wasn't necessary, and that's exactly what they were looking for. How did they know they would find it? You see, this was the whole point. That's what they had been fighting for. This was the debate that raged between them. They were fighting over this issue. The Greeks insisted that everything can be reduced down to human logic. It can all be brought down to a human level where every mitzvah in Torah can be appreciated. Almost every mitzvah. Almost every mitzvah in Torah can be appreciated for its human benefit, for its earthy benefits. The Jews insisted that that was not true. And now the idea was going to be tested. The test was, were the Greeks able to touch everything? Were they able to bring a human argument to every mitzvah, to every concept in Torah? The Jews insisted that it can't be done. It's impossible. There is more than the human condition. There is godliness. And so they knew that if they would search, they would find. Because that was their position. That was their philosophy. So they searched, and they found. Let's introduce a modern-day example. We have this phenomenon, these horrible, horrible events, where children are killing children, or adults. That's not relevant. Children are killing. Now, when children kill, we are horrified, we are shocked, not only because we expect children to behave themselves, not only because we expect children to be incapable of handling guns and making bombs, we're primarily horrified because children have no reason to kill. Of course, murder is never justified. And no matter what reason a person might have for killing, we don't permit it. We call it a crime, we call it a sin, and we prosecute people for doing it. But at the same time, we can at least understand, we can fathom the motivation, the drive, the need, the urge that an adult might have for killing another adult. A crime of passion, jealousy, competition, frustration. But why would a child ever need to kill? And so when children kill, it gives us chills. It is frightening. Because what it says, and I think this is pretty clear and obvious, there are causes, there are emotional and circumstantial causes that drive people to do bad things. They know it's bad. Everyone else knows it's bad. They know it's wrong. They know it is sinful. But they're driven. And when they lose control, they do horrible things. But there's also a time, there's also a condition in which we have become so rational. We have built all of our morality, all of our values, all of our ethics are built on such a rational, such a cerebral argument that if the argument is not accepted, there seems to be no reason not to kill. To put it in simple words, there are societies who, for some reason, whatever reason, have absorbed this message that is stated so simplistically, so unequivocally in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not murder. It is not a logical argument, or there's no argument given. It is not appealing to our sense of right and wrong. It is not asking us to respond. It's not asking us for our opinion. It simply makes this declaration. You can't do this. You can't do this. It's irrational. It has no justification, and it needs no justification. You simply can't do it. Now, such a society that has absorbed this message and the message has taken root in the mind and heart and soul of the people, murder will still occur. When someone thinks he has the ultimate, the best excuse for killing, even though it is absolutely wrong. But then you have a society that has not absorbed this message at all. It's a society that believes in not killing because killing is destructive, because killing will only come back at you. What goes around comes around. And if everybody's shooting everybody else, then nobody is safe. And it's just an irrational thing to do. It is not conducive to peaceful society. Now, this argument may convince most of the people most of the time. But in this society, there will be some people who simply are not convinced. They're not convinced. The argument is a good one, but not compelling. And so, yes, it would be terrible if everyone ran around with guns, but I don't care. So if people want to shoot me, that's fine. I'll take my chances. That is really frightening. What's happening today with children killing children is not that they're stepping out of bounds and they're violating a law. For them, there is no law. There's a logical argument, which they are not impressed by. Yeah, it's not such a good idea. No, it's not such a good idea to go around killing people. But then again, they'll take their chances. The coldness the lack of conviction, the lack of remorse, is because we've reduced morality down to a human level, and on a human level there's always on the other hand. You have an argument against murder. On the other hand, we can also argue the opposite. As long as we're arguing, as long as we're giving explanations, reasons, and rationalizations, I can offer a rationalization, I can offer a reason too. It may not be most popular, it may not be universally accepted. It's an argument. You gave me an argument, maybe your argument is better. Maybe it is more rational not to kill than to kill. So fine, so I'm not completely rational. Is that a sin? Is that absolutely wrong? So here's the point. The Greeks were saying, Hellenism, the philosophy of the Greeks, insisted that human beings are the highest, the greatest, the ultimate creature in all the universe. And what appeals to the human being is correct and right and good. And what makes sense to the human being is true and logical and rational and so on. And therefore, the human being must be the ultimate judge of all that is good, of all that is right, of all that is beautiful, and of all that is true. Truth is determined by the human being. Now, the more talented the human being becomes, the more capable, the more developed the human being becomes, the more it confirms or affirms the supremacy of the human being. And so everything that the Greeks did, everything in life became an affirmation. Everything we do is to confirm the greatness of the human being. Judaism basically says that truth lies with God. He is true. His existence is real. Ours is temporary. He is reality. We sometimes live in fantasy. And therefore, we must serve God in order to be in touch with truth and reality. With what's good and what's holy and what's right, it all lies with God. And every time we do a mitzvah, we affirm and confirm that truth is godliness. God is one, that God is true. This was the battle, this was the philosophical struggle between Judaism and the Greeks. If we're going to be convinced that murder is absolutely wrong, there's got to be something more than the human experience. There has to be something more than nature. There has to be something more than science. There has to be godliness. Now, a person within himself who has somehow gotten caught up in pursuing the human condition, the pursuit of happiness, has dedicated himself to human propositions to the point where you look at this person and you see that he is a rationalist, perhaps an atheist. He is very liberal. He is anything but spiritual. Certainly not religious. Well, he may be spiritual in a kind of a romantic sense, a New Age kind of spirituality, which is all part of being a well-rounded human being. But he doesn't have anything to do with God, with godliness, with commandments, with mitzvahs. And you might assume that a person who is so completely immersed in the human condition that they have successfully, that this person has successfully removed from himself or removed himself from anything godly at all. Now, Judaism comes along and says, it can't be. It can't be. It's not possible. Because in the soul, if you look far enough, if you look deep enough, you will find godliness. You will find a little pitcher of oil that is not human, that is not natural, that has never been touched by human consideration. It has never been affected by human argument or rationalization, and yet it's there. You can't touch it with human hands. You can't reach it with human argument. That's the little cruse of oil, that little pitcher, someplace within the heart and mind of every Jew that is pure and innocent, still sealed with the seal of the high priest. The seal of the high priest means nothing in this world is true, real, important, or meaningful except the truth of godliness. And that's why we find in Jewish history over and over again that there were Jews who had really sunk to a pretty low level, and all their lives had been swallowed up by the pursuit of human needs, human condition. And yet when put to the test, when pressed, suddenly they're willing to give it all up. Everything they had, everything they believed in, everything they devoted themselves to for all of their lives. And they were ready to die rather than deny their Jewishness. That's certainly not rational. Human logic does not dictate self-sacrifice. Human logic can dictate dying for what you believe in. But that's not self-sacrifice. That's self-preservation. When you refuse to give up your faith, that's self-preservation. You will persevere. You will refuse to give up what has made your life meaningful. That's self-preservation, not self-sacrifice. When you haven't believed in Judaism, when Judaism has not been your life's devotion, when you haven't been observing commandments, when you haven't been identifying yourself as a Jew, and then you're told to deny you're Jewish, and you can't do it, and you're willing to die rather than give up your identity, this is not self-preservation, because this has never been your self. This is self-sacrifice. There is something greater than the self, even the spiritual side of the self. So that's again the miracle of Hanukkah. Every time a Jew surprises us with his Jewishness, where we thought it was all gone, and suddenly it flares up and burns brightly, that's part of the miracle of Hanukkah. And that's why it expressed itself in the burning of the oil. Let's understand the significance of oil. The question was, can a flame burn without fuel? In order to have a flame, you have to have oil. Without oil, the wick is consumed quickly and there's no fire, there's no light. So you have to have oil. But what is the oil? What serves as oil to keep the light going, to keep the light burning in our lives? We naturally assume that oil is a motivation that is selfish, that is personal, or at least familiar. Oil means the motivation. What motivates, what keeps the fire going? Give a person a reason to be good, they'll be good. That reason is the oil. Now, what are these reasons? Self-enhancement, self-perfection, noble ideals, a little fame doesn't hurt. You can tell a person you do good things, you go down in history as a great person. Make a contribution to humankind. Get your picture in the paper. I mean, you have to give people something to make their fires burn. You've got to fuel their morality, their decency, their efforts to be good. Now, Judaism comes along and says that that's all human and fine, but that's not the truth. Judaism says, forget your picture in the paper, forget going down in history, forget being famous, forget making a contribution, forget all that stuff. Be good, do the good thing, because God said so. Now, to the humanist, that is an insult, that is ridiculous, it's absurd. You're asking people to be good without giving them oil to burn. You're not giving them motivation. You're not telling them what's in it for them. And you can't do that. No one is going to be good if you take that approach. You can't inspire someone to give of himself, to burn brightly, if there isn't going to be any oil in it for him. If there isn't going to be any human motivation, it's not going to happen. Human beings are human. And only through human motivation, only through human satisfaction, can you move a person to behave a certain way. Now, you can convince some of the people some of the time. You can brainwash them. You can make them think they're going to go to heaven. But how long do you think that's going to go on? The humanist says. If you want people to live a certain lifestyle, you have to appeal to them. You have to show them the benefits. Maybe not in the grubbiest sense of there's money in it. It's not mercenary. But you've got to give some human reason. You've got to show where it pays for the human being or for the human condition to behave a certain way. Otherwise, why would they do it? Now, the Jews kept saying, we do it, we should do it, we will do it, we will all do it, because God said so. And the Greeks kept saying, why do you think God said so? Why do you believe that God said so? Why do you obey if, in fact, God said so? Because there's something in it for you. And they said, no, we're doing it because God said so. And they insisted that that was ridiculous and insane. There was no oil. And when there's no oil, it can't burn. So when in the story of Hanukkah we are told that there was only enough oil for one day, and miraculously it burned for 8 days, what does that mean? Was there oil for 8 days or wasn't there? In the end, when it had in fact burned for 8 days, hadn't there been enough for 8 days? So the story is that there was not enough for 8 days, but it did burn for 8 days. In fact, there wasn't enough for 1 day. That's incidentally why we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days. If there was enough oil for 1 day, and then it went ahead and miraculously burned for 8 days, then there were only 7 days of miraculous lighting. Why do we celebrate 8 days? But there wasn't enough even for 1 day. And at the end of the day, the first day, when they looked at the oil that they had used to light the candles, they saw that it hadn't been consumed at all. There was as much there at the end of the day as at the beginning of the day. And so the miracle had already begun on the first night of Hanukkah. And that's why there are 8 days of celebration, not just the 7. But the point is, there was no oil. If we're talking normal, we're talking natural, on a logical level, there was no oil for all practical purposes. If there's oil for 1 day and you want to light 8 days, then you don't have oil. You can't tell me that there was enough for 1 day, but it burned for 8 days. It's a contradiction. So was there oil for 8 days or wasn't there? No, there wasn't. Did it burn for 8 days? Yes, it did. What burned? What fueled the menorah? So the oil itself was not a logical oil. The oil itself was not human. It was not natural. And that's why it's disturbing. That's why it's so disappointing when you hear Jewish leaders, when you hear rabbis insist on pointing out every logical human benefit, quality, or advantage in Torah, in mitzvahs, as if that would make Judaism wonderful. It's a dangerous thing. It's what the Greeks were saying. When Jews get excited, for example, to find out that if a woman uses a mikveh monthly, then they have a slightly lower chance of getting cervical cancer. And people say, aha! So that's what's the aha? So now you respect the mitzvah more because you found a health benefit? You now have a human reason? That's terrible. That's what we fought the Greeks over. That's why we have Hanukkah. Because we insisted that this was not the case. We insisted that the mitzvahs are not there for human reasons. They're not there for logical benefits. They're there because that's what God wants. So what are we getting so excited about when we discover a human benefit to the mitzvah? Now, of course, it's not a coincidence. There are fringe benefits. A person living a good life will naturally also have a healthier life. It follows. But to say that that's why the mitzvah is there, that that's what we should get excited about, that justifies the mitzvah, that's not Judaism. That's not why we've been devoted to the mitzvahs all through history. Somebody pointed out an interesting thing. Fasting on Yom Kippur. It's something that Jews are devoted to the very fiber of their soul. For most Jews, not to fast on Yom Kippur is unthinkable. It's unthinkable. Yom Kippur is Yom Kippur. Those same Jews who would never eat on Yom Kippur may smoke cigarettes, 2 packs a day. And you're thinking, what's going on with this guy? If he is such a disciplined person that he can fast on Yom Kippur, why doesn't he stop smoking? If fasting on Yom Kippur was some kind of a health law, if keeping kosher was some kind of a health law, then how do we explain people who keep strictly kosher, fast on Yom Kippur, but smoke 2 packs a day? What does this tell us? It tells us that we have a devotion for things that are godly, that is much deeper, much stronger, much greater than the devotion we have to human logic, to health considerations, to nature. And you come to a person and you say, this is unhealthy. You're going to get really sick. And the person says, oh, fine, okay, I'll stop tomorrow. I'm trying to quit. I've quit many times. I'll quit again. It doesn't really shake them. It doesn't really touch them in the way that a child is touched when you say it's not kosher. And so they don't eat it. That's it. End of conversation. And the same child, you tell them the sugar, the candy, it's not healthy. It's kosher, but it's not healthy. It'll make you sick. It'll ruin your teeth. It'll give you a stomachache. Oh, no. Oh, no? Why? Because the threat to your health, the ill effects, the unnaturalness of it doesn't touch us as deeply as the simple statement, God said no. It's really an amazing thing. You would think that it's the other way around. In fact, religion actually did this. Religion came along and said, the Bible, the way the Jews teach it, is so intangible. It's so otherworldly. It's not going to affect people. It's not going to move people. You want people to obey the laws. You want them to abide by these laws. Bring it down to a level where they can appreciate it. Something that'll hit them where they live. Something that's visceral. Example. You tell someone that certain behavior is a sin. It's a sin. That's not good enough. You also have to tell them that sin is unforgivable. Because for sinning, you have to go to hell forever and ever. This will move people. Just telling them that it is wrong is too abstract. It's too distant. People can't relate to it. Tell them that they're going to go to hell. That will move them. Now you're convincing them. And you got to come on strong. You got to paint a picture. Paint a picture of hell. You have to have little demons with the tridents, and they stab you, and they burn you, and they've got sharp teeth. Now you're hitting people where they live. Bring it down to earth so they can appreciate it. That will make them abide by the rules. Better yet, instead of calling it a sin, call it unnatural. Call it a perversion. You can call people sinners, and they're not very moved by that. But call them perverts. Now you're really hurting them. Now you're getting through. That was the argument. That's a religious approach. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. First of all, it's not kosher to tamper with Torah. Just like we're not allowed to subtract any of the commandments. We're not allowed to eliminate any of the commandments. We are also commanded in the Torah not to embellish. But the argument itself, that this will move people more deeply, that it will touch them more deeply, ultimately it is not true. It's simply not true. We are far more godly than religion gives us credit for. Because in the end, a person would rather believe he's perverted than believe that he has sinned. Sounds amazing? A person would rather think he's going to get punished than think that he did something wrong. Haven't you heard people say, go ahead, punish me, but I didn't do anything wrong? You read all sorts of rules, articles, papers on what to do for your health. How much does it move people? Everybody intends to someday get around to it. But people study Torah, and all of a sudden, where it says you can't do that, they don't do it. Why is it that people's behavior is much more deeply affected by what Torah says than by what doctors say? Because the Greeks were wrong. They are wrong. The deepest, the highest, the truest, most fundamental response in the human being is not logic and not nature. It's godliness. And that's what Hanukkah means. That's what Hanukkah is all about. Now we have a similar battle raging all over again. And of course, it's about Hanukkah. Only this time the argument is with a fellow Jew. Lubavitch, the Rebbe, wants to put up menorahs, big menorahs, in public places to let people know that it's Hanukkah. And the reason, as we said before, in this argument with the Greeks, we have a position. We are debating an issue. And we're convinced that we are right. And therefore we have to convince others. This idea that we serve God beyond, above, much deeper and much more truer than the devotion to the human being, the devotion to ourselves and to human values, this is something that every human being must have. The Jew is a light to the nations by being a miracle, by being this little cruse of oil. Because we experience this connection to God that transcends the natural, the logical, and the obvious. We therefore have something to offer. We can be a light to the nations. But to offer it means that we have to convince them that it is true of them as well. That they too must serve God. They too must teach their children. Thou shalt not kill, because God doesn't want you to. And God, who is infinite and true and eternal, doesn't want you to kill infinitely, truly, and eternally. And so it's important that we light the menorah where it can be seen. And it's important that the message of the menorah be repeated, be stated, be convincing.